Welcome to Your Texas Land, a place where we take a deep dive into all things related to land in Texas. I'm your host today, Shane Kiefer. In each episode, we explore topics that might affect you as a landowner. Today, I'm joined by Debra Bawcom, President and Senior Property Tax Consultant from Texas ProTax. And we're going to have a conversation about something we don't typically discuss, which is market value. We spend a lot of time talking about open space and special valuations, ag, wildlife, all those things, but market value is the basis for our property tax system, and we want to make sure that we get a conversation going about why it's important, even if you're in open space, even if you think you've got everything taken care of, why you need to pay attention to market value, where does it come from, what do we do about it, all those sorts of things. So Debra, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Let's start by just talking a little bit about Texas ProTax. It's one of the larger, if not the largest, property tax consulting firms in the state. Is that right?
Yes, we are one of the larger property tax consulting firms in Texas. We are 36 years here in the Austin area. However, we do have offices throughout the state and represent property owners all over the state in their market value and special valuation appeals. We discuss both those important topics of market valuation appraisal process, as well as sometimes get into those ag issues or help folks out like Plateau to discuss those ag issues.
Very good. And so you work all over the state. Do you have areas of particular focus, areas where you spend most of your time?
Sure. Our main focus is in Central Texas and in the Houston markets as far as the geographic locations. We typically represent residential properties and commercial properties, although our niche, unlike most big property tax consulting firms, is land and residential. You don't find many property tax consulting firms out there with such a focus like ours. Most are focused just on commercial properties or commercial development, whereas we're willing to take a look at residential development. We're willing to take a look at residential properties, vacant land, you name it. We're going to talk about it when it comes to real property in Texas.
Very good. That's something we run into all the time. A lot of our landowners, listeners, longtime clients, they've got land with a residence on it, right? Whether it's their primary residence or not, they've got land and a home. And of course, we're dealing with the open space side of things, wildlife, ag, whatever that may be. But they've still got this piece, whether it's a half acre, an acre or more, that's appraised at full market value.
That's
right?
correct.
They've got to deal with.
Right. And any structures or improvements that they've put onto that property are being appraised at full market value, whether it's the barn that's even with your ag operation, or whether it's your house out there, or any other structures you may have put on the properties. And again, any of the land associated with some of those properties that's not included in your ag are going to be at full market value, taxed every year at those numbers, as opposed to seeing those special appraisal values that you see with ag. So it's always important to look at that market value property, market value approach.
And so people should be paying attention to all that. Any structure, whether it's residential land or even agricultural structures, are going to be taxed at that market value.
Correct. And they ought to pay attention to it every year. It's reappraised every year for the most part throughout the state. And so you want to look at you want to understand what those numbers are. You want to look at those numbers, see if they accurately reflect the market, and potentially protest those values and tell the appraisal district you disagree and go in and have that discussion.
Let's talk about that some. How does an appraisal district, most folks, all they know is the appraisal districts, or somebody tells them my property's worth X.
Right.
There's got to be a process. Most people probably assume there's some process.
Correct.
No matter how they feel about it, there's some process to get to a value.
Sure.
Can you talk just the basics? How does an appraisal district say, all right, your house and the land on it are worth this?
Sure. The appraisal districts and the appraisal process and cycle in Texas is very cyclical. Every year, the appraisal districts will decide what market value is as of January 1st. That's their target date. So even though you're discussing the property maybe in mid-April when they send out their notice of appraised value, or during the protest process, which may be mid to late summer, you're still discussing that value as it was as of January 1 and what sat on on the property as of that date. So if you build something later in the year, that's not an issue until the following year. However, the appraisal districts are typically looking at properties anywhere in the fall and early spring of each year to come up with those January 1st values based on sales data, maybe based on permits, maybe based on what they've driven by and seen you building on your property. And so they may come up with estimates based on cost or market data that they have in the area. Maybe a similar ranch sold near you, maybe another house sold in your area, maybe in a commercial building like yours sold in the area. And that would give the appraisal district some indication of what your value should be. They would make adjustments for maybe differences in those values, but again, they appraise on a broad stroke, meaning they use a mass appraisal technique is the technical term. But what it basically comes down to is they set up models and say, we're going to appraise all residential property based on these sales using this methodology. And with that, they'll set a value for your particular property. Then in April, they send you what that value is in their opinion. Now, what's nice in Texas, unlike many other states, is that you have an opportunity to protest that at no cost. They cannot charge you to file a protest, as opposed to some other states that maybe can. And so you can actually file a protest with the appraisal review board or with the appraisal district. You get an opportunity to go in and discuss that valuation. Maybe you know about other sales that the district didn't know about. Maybe you have your property listed or you're considering selling it. Maybe there's some defects in your property that they don't know about. Maybe you have some leaks or some mold or some damage that's extraordinary. And you're able to go in and discuss that with the appraisal district and ultimately with the appraisal review board, where you have a formal hearing. You get to present your evidence. The appraisal district will present their opinion of value and their evidence. And then the appraisal review board will make a decision on that value and send it to you. Even after that, in Texas, you still have opportunity to appeal if you want to. So our system here in Texas is very open to a property owner's engagement. And of course, as a property tax consultant in my world, we encourage that engagement. Sure. We encourage property owners to look at their values and to consider it. Even if they have special appraisal, it's still really important to consider that market valuation.
So let's go there. I've got my wildlife management valuation on my land. That's would be the bulk of my savings, right? I may be, instead of paying $10,000 in taxes, property taxes on my land, I'm paying maybe a few $100s, sure. or less, depending on where I am because of that valuation. So I got a lot of savings from that. Why do I need to pay attention to my house and that residential land around it?
Right. Shane, that's a great question. Really, the reason is because that savings is only in that year and it's only at that moment, right? And so if you change anything about your property, you are subject with a special valuation, you're subject to a change in use determination, which means that you have done something different than your agricultural activity. Mm-hmm. And therefore, you're going to be hit with what they call a rollback tax, which basically says you're going to pay the difference in taxes that you saved for the last 3 years. And so looking at the agricultural valuation in the first year, yes, that's absolutely a savings in that year and maybe the next year. But maybe the third year, you decide to put it on the market. You're going to still need to grapple with that market value then at that point, should the new developer or the new buyer come in and want to change that use. You're saying that's a new buyer. Who cares? Well, it makes you more profitable, more sellable, if you will, or more enticing to purchase if you've kept on top of your market values versus the farm next door that maybe didn't. And so if you've gone in every year, discuss those valuations, maybe reduce that market value to something more reasonable, that's going to be less of that rollback tax you're going to pay in the future. And it's more enticing for a developer to look at. Let's discuss one other issue why you might want to go ahead and look at that market value every year as well, is oftentimes in the middle of the year, the appraisal district may come back and decide something went wrong on an application process, or maybe they made a mistake in granting ag, and so therefore they pull it off in the middle of a year, and all of a sudden you haven't discussed market value, and now you don't have the protections of your special use valuation, and so you're paying on this market value that's overinflated if you're not protesting it. So even if you're not considering selling and you're considering it passing it on to family or to other descendants at some point, you still want to take a look at that market value just to make sure it's in line with what properties are selling for.
And that's just to keep it in line with the market?
Keep it in line with market, but also equity. One thing that's really overlooked in Texas, oftentimes by property owners, is the concept that not only do you get to compare your property at how it would sell against other properties that sold, but you also get to compare your property on how others are being appraised. So if you've got neighbors around you that, for whatever reason, they have not been reappraised as significantly as your land, you may have a serious discussion there on an equity basis that you're inequitably appraised and therefore could see relief in your market value.
We see that occasionally just looking at, we're dealing with special valuation, but looking at land values. I've seen it on my own personal property, so I'd love your take on this. It's almost, if you're looking at the list of values from a neighborhood or from an area, it's almost like you can tell who protests annually and who doesn't, because there's quite a disparity often in very similar properties that may be how they're valued.
There really can be, yes. And one, if the appraisal district gets wind of you building something new or of you selling a property, your property might get reappraised a little bit differently than some of the others, because they have to pass an annual exam from the comptroller's office saying, did they appraise appropriately? And so if they go after your sale or your new construction, but then fail to, for whatever reason, reappraise the rest of your neighborhood, all of a sudden you kind of stick out like a sore thumb, right? And you're then not appraised equitably. Additionally, along the lines of what you're talking about, if people are protesting every year, then or have a professional in their protesting forum who maybe really understands the system and the marketplace and those equity protest rules, they're going to often see lower valuations year over year than what maybe somebody sees not going in and discussing those valuations, because they're always at 100% of the appraisal district's opinion at the beginning of the year, which after the protest process, hopefully you're not at that number.
Right, that's the goal. So how do, if I'm considering what you said, you should be paying attention to that market value, you should be protesting. Would you say protest every year?
I would.
What's y'all's approach?
Yeah, we recommend protesting every year. If you get into the protest process and ultimately decide your valuation is fair and it's at market value or even below market value, you can always withdraw that protest. No harm, no foul. It's just a simple withdrawal of your protest. However, you can't go back and protest later if you decide you don't like it later down the road. So we always encourage our property owners and our clients to protest every year. We encourage them to at least let us take a look at it. Again, we can withdraw, or we can have the board not change the value, and therefore if something comes up in the next 60 days or so, when we still have that protest and appeal opportunity, we can still address that. But oftentimes, when you get that notice of appraised value in April and you only have until May 15th to file that protest, you may not be able to really consider that valuation in just that short amount of time. So it's better to get that protest in, get your hearing date established, and then you're able to go in and discuss your evidence.
So part of it's just keeping your options open.
Correct.
Should you learn that even if you think it's perfectly fair and you don't want to, it keeps your options open to deal with it farther down the line.
Absolutely. Because who knows, your neighbor may come up for sale the next day.
Sure.
And change your opinion on what you think the value should be. And
absolutely.
Yeah, we encourage every year you review it. They could have made a mistake in some of their valuation models, which creates an abnormally, high value for you that shouldn't be appropriate. And so if you don't protest, though, you don't get to talk about those issues.
That's right. Because as you said, they're doing it on this mass appraisal approach, right? They're not looking at your individual property and saying, these are the characteristics and this is what this should be worth. They're looking at your neighborhood.
They're looking at your entire neighborhood, maybe your school district, maybe your subdivision, or just your particular phase in a subdivision, depending on how large that neighborhood is, how large the county is, and how large their scope of work needs to be each year.
And so a small error maybe in how they're calculating that could result in something being off on yours.
Yes.
For instance, if they have your square footage wrong.
Correct. If they have your square footage wrong, or if they have your land calculation wrong somehow. They say that you have 10 acres, but they have it appraised at $10,000 an acre instead of at $15,000 an acre, which is what maybe their models show, that you don't really get to see before you protest.
That's
so
right.
You're
and that's a good point too. We do deal with land that is the wrong size on the rules, right? Correct. They're working off what they've got on the rolls,
Correct.
or on the tax records, and determining it based on that. And while square footage of a house may be off, so could the size of your property. They may not, especially if you own 5 or 6 parcels. You may not realize that they think you own 50 acres and you actually only own 45, and they're valuing you. You're paying taxes on that extra 5 acres you don't own.
That is absolutely correct. We see all the time mistakes in mapping in deed records. The appraisal districts really try hard to follow the meets and bounds descriptions and the lot and block platting descriptions that are filed with the county. However, mistakes are made, and we see those kind of errors quite often where maybe you've taken your 20 acres and you've now divided it into 5 4-acre tracts, and all of a sudden they have all of those new tracts set up and failed to delete the original track. And so now all of a sudden you're paying taxes on 40 acres instead of 20. And it's easy to miss if you're not really paying attention. And again, those notices come out mid-April. Usually it's by April 15th or as soon as after there is practicable, but usually around April 15th, mid-April, the appraisal district will send out those notices of appraised value, and it will tell you the size of the land that that they have recorded. It'll tell you the values you have on it. It'll tell you if you have any special valuation or if you have any other exemptions on the property. So you want to pay attention to that notice of appraised value that just comes regular mail. It may come by email. So you want to be on the lookout for it and know that it's going to be delivered.
And tell us again, that should be delivered
Around April 15th.
around April 15th. Okay. Like a lot of things, should be, isn't always. Tax bills should be delivered
Around October 1st.
We just got ours here at the business. So, it's December now. So
Yes.
I think we got it late November. I didn't get one personally in 2024 until, and I'm in Hayes County until January.
Correct.
They're very late.
The appraisal district, they're supposed to notice the valuations each year by April 15th. Tax bills are supposed to start going out October 1st. However, in this year in particular, a lot of taxes and tax decisions were left to the voters. And so because they were left to the voters, taxing entities really couldn't send out tax bills until those votes came in.
That's right.
So they
It's
are
not all
very
their
late
fault.
this year.
It's not to blame the appraisal districts. They've got a lot of work to do.
It's the nature of the calendar sometimes. And technically, all you have to have is 21 days notice to pay your tax bill. And theoretically, you don't even have to receive a tax bill to know as a property owner in Texas that you owe taxes.
Oh, very good.
So therefore, you want to be aware in January. You better, if you haven't seen a tax bill, you want to start looking for
Start
it.
looking for it. Yeah, absolutely. So you've talked about the notice of appraised value in April, tax bills in October. What other sorts of notices should folks look
We
for?
definitely want to be lookout, especially if you have special valuation. You want to be looking out for any notice of special valuation changes or reapplications. With wildlife, obviously, you have that annual report. Of course, you're probably hiring Plateau to do that for you.
I hope so.
But at the same time, if the appraisal district's sending you a notice, don't assume they're sending it to your agent. Don't assume they're sending it to Plateau. Let them know. We have more than many examples showing where an appraisal district will send a new notice to a property owner, forget to send it to their agent or their ag management company, and they're all of a sudden they're missing deadlines. Of course, that deadline for that special valuation is April 30th. Deadline for most exemptions is also April 30th. So you want to make sure that even though you're just receiving that notice April 15th or sometime soon after, you still have a deadline, regardless if you've received that or not, to act on that special valuation or even those exemptions. And then the other hard deadline you must know about is the May 15th protest deadline. And so we encourage all of our property owners to protest by May 15th, even if they haven't received notice yet. Okay. There are some small cases in the property tax laws that say the appraisal district doesn't have to send notice if they don't increase your value. So therefore, your value may not have changed from last year. That doesn't mean it's right. So you still want to protest it. You may not get notice, but your deadline is still May 15th. So if there's some hard deadlines out there, May 15th is one of them.
I had that happen just this year. It wasn't a major issue, but the landlord called and said, well, I haven't received these notices. And these were small dollars and lots of property, but that turns out why, because I'm not, and it's been a long time since actually I've taken your class, and had forgotten that, we're just used to them sending notices, but they're not required to if the value doesn't increase over a certain amount, right?
We've noticed in Travis County, for example, with larger county, that they budgeted on the fact that they wouldn't have to send notices if they didn't increase values. And it was like a line item savings for them in the year because postage is expensive, right? And so we have seen some of these counties that have very tight budgets that will forego noticing if they don't change values. But that means your deadlines are still all in place, even if you haven't received those pieces of paper.
And can you request a notice from the appraisal district?
Yes, you absolutely can. You need to have that request in their hands prior to April 15th. And so, and you're requesting a property valuation report, you're requesting that notice. Typically, it's along with something you're telling them about the property, saying, I think this is important for you to know in appraising my property. And they should respond to that.
Very good. So watch out for notices. Always open mail from the appraisal district.
Always.
If you have questions, we say this to folks a lot. If you have questions, if you don't know how to read it, call us. I'm sure you get those calls all the time from your clients. What does this mean? Sometimes it means something. A lot of times it means not much.
Correct.
And so having that professional resource just to make sure that you're paying attention to what you need to is really, really
Absolutely.
valuable.
And we're happy to take those phone calls, whether you're a client or not, with our firm. I mean, if you have a question about the property tax system, we know we're the experts. We know that we know what we're talking about with those notices of appraised value and those valuation processes. And we're more than happy to have that conversation with you. And we'll take a look at it. If we can't help you, we're going to tell you that. If we think we can, then we'd like you to be our client. But not everybody we can help, nor do they always need it. But we encourage you to protest, and we encourage you to at least research it and understand it.
Very good. You mentioned exemption deadlines. Of course, our listeners, clients should all know that open space applications are due before May 1st, which means April 30th.
Right.
We do lots and lots of work in those first few months of the year to meet those deadlines. But you mentioned other exemptions typically being due around the same time. What types of other exemptions might landowners or homeowners want to make sure they're paying attention to?
Anyone who owns a property in Texas that's their primary residence wants to make sure that they have applied for and received their homestead exemption at the very least. Even if you have special valuation, as you've discussed, your home, the improvements on that property are not included in that special valuation, and they're appraised at full market value. However, if you apply for the homestead exemption for your primary residence, it does have to be your primary. Your address on your driver's license has to match that address. And so those are some of the real technical rules that are out there, and you only get one. Yeah. So, but if it's your primary residence, apply for that homestead exemption. You're saying, why do I need to do that? Well, in your school district, it gives you a $100,000 discount in the school district alone. In other jurisdictions, there will be varying degrees of discounts, but it also allows you to have a cap or a valuation limitation on your market value each year on that homestead property, on that part of your property that's in your homestead. And that's a 10% limitation. So if you own a home, let's say in a county here in Central Texas, let's say Hays County, and it's appraised at $200,000 this year, and for the market value portion of your residence homestead and maybe the acre under it. And we're not talking about your special valuation. That's going to be appraised on a different line item, right? But your house is appraised at $200,000 with the land associated with it. And next year, the appraisal district decides that the market indicates that valuation should be increased to $250,000. They can do that. They can increase the market value as much as they think they can defend, but your taxable value only increases to $220,000 because that increase is limited by a 10% cap, is what we call it. So instead of paying on $250,000, you're paying on $220,000 at the start of your tax bill. But again, because you get that discount in the school district, you're only paying on $120,000 in the school district. So there's some very significant discounts and very significant advantages to that homestead valuation and that homestead exemption that you're eligible for.
And that 10% cap only applies to properties under the homestead.
Only applies to properties under a homestead exemption.
Okay.
Yes.
So if you own land and a second residence, you don't have the homestead exemption, that value, appraised value, can go up.
Correct.
As much as
the appraisal district thinks that the market supports.
Okay. Very good. What else? Any other just quick hits on exemptions to pay attention to?
Obviously, if you're over 65, there's an exemption for folks who are over 65. There's an exemption for disabled persons that's similar to an over 65 exemption. The over 65 exemption allows for your school taxes to actually freeze at a ceiling so that they can't be increased after that in any given year unless you make new construction, basically. But it really freezes that school district tax for you. And in some jurisdictions, like in Williamson County, the county freezes. Most of the cities freeze. So depending on your jurisdictions, depending on your counties, that over 65 and disabled persons exemptions can be really beneficial to a sustained income that then you won't see that increase in fluctuation with the market that you might without that exemption there. Another exemption is disabled veterans can find exemptions for their homesteads. For any property, really, a disabled veteran can have an exemption on one property in Texas, regardless of what property that is, for their disabled veteran status, and it's based on the degree of disability according to the Veterans Affairs. But if it is your homestead and you are 100% disabled, you are entitled to 100% exemption on your homestead. So we definitely got to help out our veterans there.
Can't beat that. Absolutely.
Maybe I should reiterate, as Shane said earlier, open mail from the appraisal district. There are specific statutory requirements the appraisal districts are facing every year where they may have to send out surveys and ask you questions, and they may have to audit some of their records. And so you may get a random letter from them asking for new proof of your homestead or proof of your current exemption status, just like you would with special appraisal. Reprove it, make sure that you're still operating your special appraisal as you have been, so that you're still entitled to that special valuation. Same with exemptions. They may ask you to reapply. They may ask you to prove up your status to make sure it's correct. So open the mail from the appraisal district. Again, if you have questions, that's what we're here for, to help answer.
That's right. Their job is to make sure they're applying these things properly.
Correct.
And sometimes they've got to check and confirm that what they have in their records is accurate. And of course, we see that with open space all the time. They just, wildlife management's a good example, send me an annual report. Show me what you did so that we can confirm that you deserve this. With ag, same thing. They can ask at any time and say, show me what your agricultural activities have been so we can confirm that this still applies to you. They may do the same thing for other exemptions, just to make sure that they're properly applying it. Because again, these are significant tax breaks in a lot of cases, and their job is to properly administer the tax laws, right?
That is correct.
And so answer the questions honestly and don't worry about it. And if you have concerns, then call somebody to get help. So let's talk. We talked a little bit about protesting already. You said protest every year. You can always withdraw it. It doesn't cost anything. I didn't know that other states charge to protest. That's interesting, but probably not relevant. Florida does? Oh, okay.
$15 a pop.
Oh, okay. It probably cuts down on some protests. But Texas lets you protest for free. It's your right to protest any decision by the appraisal district that could affect your tax liability, whether it's the market value, whether it's a denial or removal of open space, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, denial of exemptions. Any of those things are protestable actions, right?
That is correct. And the appraisal district, when they send their notice of appraised value to you, usually on the back or on another page within that packet, there will be a protest form you can fill out. I would highly encourage that you check all the boxes of why you want to protest. Don't leave any off, because you don't want to be in a situation where you get into a hearing and somebody's telling you didn't check the right box. And so I encourage you to protest everything. You can always withdraw those topics if that's something you don't want to discuss, but at least check market and equity. If there is a special valuation issue on the property, obviously you want to check those boxes, but you want to make sure that you completely fill out the form to file your protest so that you don't get caught in some kind of red tape that says you didn't properly fill it out.
That's right.
But yes, that will be included with your protest notice. You can also send just a letter in saying you're dissatisfied. You don't have to use that form, although the form is easy for everyone to track and keep up with. It helps their administrative process to get your hearing scheduled. So
yes, they'd probably appreciate it if you'd use the right form.
Yes.
Even though, and maybe it was you I heard say this, but you could literally write it on a napkin.
You can.
Say, I'm dissatisfied with this thing, and that's a valid protest in the state. Is that right?
The case law does say that. It says you can literally write it on a napkin and just say you're dissatisfied. Again, we kind of, to somewhat tongue-in-cheek, fill out our protest forms with a cover letter that says that, and then we list every reason so that we make sure we're not missing any of those reasons to protest.
Absolutely. Very good. So that process, if I protest, you said check lots of boxes. If I don't have an issue with my special valuation, there's no concerns, there's no issues, I really just want to protest my market value. I think you said the two boxes that are most important.
Right.
Market value and equity.
And they're actually required to be combined into one one box now so that the property owner doesn't get thrown out on that technicality.
Of not checking that second box.
Correct. And so now you're unhappy with the market or equitable value. And therefore you check that box and you're able to talk about just valuation. In those hearings, theoretically, your special valuation eligibility process valuation shouldn't even come into play.
Should not.
All you're talking about is market value at that point or the appraised value based on equity at that point, and not discussing that status of your special valuation or status of your exemption.
So we can keep those things separate when dealing with an issue. Protesting one isn't going to endanger something else if I'm not.
Correct. I mean, it really doesn't endanger it. Obviously, if you get in there and say, well, I haven't had cows on my property in years, I mean, that then makes you subject to endangerment.
Yes.
But
Yes.
generally, you are not at risk at all of threatening your exemption status or threatening a special valuation status simply because you want to come in and talk about your market valuation.
Very good.
And when you do talk about your market valuation, especially in appraisal districts where you have the property under one parcel ID, so say you have 50 acres, and on that 50 acres, you have 45 that are dedicated to your special valuation, you have 5 acres dedicated to your home site and your homestead, you still are going to talk about the market valuation as a whole. You're still looking at that entire property as 50 acres. You're not just looking at the 5 acres of your homestead. So be sure that whenever you're talking apples to apples and you're looking at what is selling in the area or how other properties are selling in the area, that you're considering your whole package. Even just pretend the special valuation's not there. You're kind of just looking at that whole package of what market value means for that property, and not just separating out the different elements. It really is the sum of the total that you're discussing with the appraisal district.
Excellent. That leads me to a more particular and precise issue and I'm curious how often you might see this. It's something that I've tried to pay attention to. You were talking about a 50-acre single parcel, but let's say we've got a 49-acre parcel and a 1-acre residential parcel that's attached to it. Mm-hmm. So a separate parcel. I can deal with those parcels independently, right? But there is a section of the law that says, well, the appraisal district should be considering that as a farm and ranch unit, essentially, right?
Right.
They're not supposed to treat my 1-acre residential parcel like any other 1-acre residential parcel. Is that right?
Well, yeah, and it really comes out of the courts. It comes out of the case law. There's not a particular statutory section that says treat it as a whole, but their USPAP directions, which that's the Uniform Standards for Appraisal Practice, which what appraisal districts are required to follow in their appraisal techniques. They are required to look at a land or look at a property as a whole. They're required to say if there's a legal entity that owns these 5 tracts of land, that you should look at them as a whole.
Not just because there's a different parcel number on different pieces. Okay.
Because oftentimes a property may have been purchased in separate tracts, right? And so those each have come into the ownership conglomerate, but yet they are still being appraised as separate properties. Well, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be going in saying, I want to talk about my whole ranch or my whole farm. And you want to make sure that the appraisal district's also talking about that whole property and not just comparing you. There's no way your 1-acre home site should be compared to a subdivision with 1-acre home sites when you're sitting on another 49 acres. Right. That's just not appropriate. And that's what the case law has required of appraisal districts. That's what their standards require, that they look at that property as that 50-acre tract.
Very good. So even if they're separate parcels, think of it as a single unit, a single property. We deal with that all the time with wildlife and ag. Mm-hmm. The open space guidelines are real clear. The comptroller's rules are real clear. If you've got 5 parcels that you use as an operation, that's one operation. It's not 5 different operations that all need to meet these different standards. It's a single operation. It sounds like.
And the exemptions are the same way. If you've got up to 20 acres that you can have under your homestead exemption, then it doesn't all have to be in one lot. It can be in.
That's a good point.
As many lots as you want, as long as they're contiguous and as long as they are identically owned. So yes, it's again, Texas law, everywhere that it talks about these conglomerates of properties, considers them as a whole.
A single unit.
A single unit.
So we talk with landowners all the time about making an open space application or wildlife application. We often get asked, well, can I do that on my own? And of course, there's nothing in the law that says you can't do it on your own. There's no requirement that you hire anybody or that you use Parks and Wildlife or anyone else to file an open space application or file a wildlife management plan. But there's lots of reasons that you should, because the details are a lot more complicated at times than they sound, and understanding individual appraisal districts and what they're looking for and what they require, and understanding what's appropriate for your property. So at least on that side, landowners are free to do things on their own. What about on managing market values and protesting? Is that something they can do by themselves?
Shane, it's very similar. You absolutely can protest on your own. There's nothing prohibiting that. The nice part about hiring an expert, especially someone like Texas ProTax, a group like us, we have a proprietary database that mimics the appraisal district's data. So we want to know more about that property than the appraisal district knows about it. We understand their models on how they developed their valuations, so we can pick that information apart if we think you're classed inappropriately or graded inappropriately, or they think your remodel is newer than it really is. We are able to look at those details, dig into that data, and really pick apart that information. We also have access to sales information. We have access to other appraisal models that show how properties should be appraised, how they should be adjusted, and how they compare to each other. And so our level of expertise, my newest agent has been with me for over 5 years. I don't have turnover with my agents, and I have subject matter experts all over the state. We have agents in my office who are specific to neighborhoods, specific to counties, specific to property types. And so if you really want someone who knows all about hotels, I've got a guy for you, right? If you really want someone who knows all about just vacant land that has ag property on it, I've got somebody for that in my group. And we encourage our property agents to attain their licensing. Most of my agents have their senior consulting license, which means they could operate on their own if they wanted to, but they don't. They're with me because our firm is really going to support what they do for our clients. One thing at Texas ProTax that I pride myself on, not only being family owned and female owned, but we really care about each individual property owner. I've always taken the approach that my clients are our employees, as being the president of the firm, and my employees' clients are the firm's clients, and they're expected to treat them the way that I would want them to treat me. And we have a servant leadership philosophy in our office. We help each other out. We're teammates. And while at the same time being that expert in our particular areas, whether it's property type or county or neighborhood. And that level of expertise allows us to have a much more detailed and focused conversation with the appraisal district and the appraisal review board to achieve better results than a property owner going in, not understanding the system as well, and somewhat all over the board with some of their arguments. We're able to kind of just get down to the brass tacks of what we're discussing, and our results prove that.
Very good. We see the same thing on open space side of things. There are lots of issues to discuss potentially, lots of things that can come up, but it's really typically about one or two particular things. And if we can address those, we can resolve the issue and move on.
Correct.
That's just when you're dealing with it day in and day out, you can get to the root of the problem pretty quickly. So it's
like I say, you hire experts all the time in your personal life, whether it's your accountant, whether it's your air conditioning guy, whether it's your doctor or lawyer, you're hiring an expert that's their subject matter, expertise in that field, and you're going to trust them to do what's right for you. Our fiduciary relationship is the same with our clients. We're the expert there for them to rely on with property tax. And like I said, we'll be real upfront with you. If we can't help you, we're going to tell you. But we're also going to tell you how you can help yourself if we can't be that person.
That's one of the things that as I keyed in on the last time we spoke was that approach, because we answer questions all the time from folks that will never be a client, but they've got a question about this and that, and or maybe they were a client 20 years ago, but they call and say, I don't understand this thing from the appraisal district, and it's nothing we can even help them with, but we can give them some assurance that it's either not something to worry about, or here's where you go to get that addressed.
Correct.
If it's going to be a problem.
Exactly the same. I expect that from all of our staff. And again, the amount of loyalty I have within my staff and lack of turnover. I have experts from all of my admin staff to my agent staff, and that's what we do every day. We are there to answer those questions. We answer our phones. We are present and accountable for our representation for our property owners.
Debra, and I do want to thank you very much for your time today. I always enjoy talking to you. I always learn something talking to you. And even when I'm not taking your class, you've described a system, a property tax system in Texas that even if it, I don't know if you'd say encourages, but certainly rewards people who get involved, right? It's one of the few taxes you actually have some control over what you pay, just because you have this right to protest. I can't go into a store and say, well, I don't want to pay 8.25% sales tax, right? I've got to pay the sales tax on whatever I buy. Property taxes, despite the fact that there aren't many fans of it, but at least you've got some say in how your values are set. You don't get you have the power to vote on tax rates occasionally and things like that, or who sets tax rates, but at the appraisal level, you've got some say in how your property's valued. Is that fair?
I think that's really fair. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and chat with you. I always enjoy our conversations and always look forward to the next ones that we have. But I think you're exactly correct. One thing that I really love about the Texas property tax system and what's unique about it is that in the federal income tax system, you may call and say, hey, I want to make this adjustment or that adjustment to my return, but you don't get a whole lot of interaction with it. You don't really get to appeal it. It's what it is. Same with the sales tax as you described. It's just you pay it. There's not really a whole lot of discussion. There is no discussion. Maybe you can go to some city council meetings. But in property tax, it's your one opportunity as a citizen here in Texas and as a resident here in Texas, or even a non-resident in Texas as a property owner in Texas. It's your one opportunity to be engaged in the government system, to be engaged in the governing body. You get to help decide your valuation. You can even help decide your tax rates. You can go to taxing discussions with your jurisdictions. You can voice your opinions at those meetings. You can vote on those rates. And then even more importantly, you can talk about your individual property. And there's nothing more as an American citizen, as a property owner in Texas, that makes you feel like you have some control in the chaos of all of our world governing taxes to say you can go in and discuss that. And I think that's a really important responsibility that I know our firm takes very seriously and takes that right that you're entrusting us with very seriously. But I think that's one thing that's unique about the Texas system is that level of engagement that you can get. And I think it's so important to exercise that every year.
Every year. So let's wrap up with that. Key takeaways. What are the 2 or 3 or 4 things that you always tell people?
Your appraisal date's always January 1st. What was your property as of that date? Make sure you're sending in those applications and or special appraisal applications or exemption applications timely. That deadline is generally April 30th. Your notices should come out mid-April. Biggest date on your calendar if you're going to file a protest is that May 15th deadline. And you can find us at texasprotax.com. You can give us a call. Again, we're happy to talk to you, answer those questions, and help you out.
Very good. Well, thank you so much again, Debra. That's a wrap for today's episode of Your Texas Land. We hope you all enjoyed hearing more about Texas ProTax and the market value system in Texas and how those things are determined and what you should be paying attention to. And until next time, keep being an advocate for Texas land, and thank you for listening.